The hand on Celeste Armand's elbow was gentle. That was the first thing she noticed, how gentle it was, how practiced. Officer Brennan's grip was the kind that had been trained not to leave marks, not to invite footage, not to give anyone in the atrium below a reason to lift their phone. He smiled at her as he touched her. He was still smiling when he said, quietly, close to her ear, that perhaps it would be best if she came with him. She had been standing in front of the East Wing directory, studying it. She had been in the mall for 11 minutes. She was wearing a cream linen blazer, pressed dark trousers, low-heeled shoes that had seen better days. She had a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a small notebook in her left hand. And she had been marking something down, a store number, a tenant name, something she noticed about the signage, when the two officers materialized at her flanks as though they had always been there. "Ma'am," said the second one, Kowalski, according to his badge, "we've had a report." She looked at him steadily. "A report?" "That's right." "What kind of report?" Brennan's smile adjusted slightly. It became more patient. "There's been a concern raised about loitering." She looked down at her notebook. She looked back up at him. "I've been here 11 minutes. Ma'am, if you'd just come with us." "I'm looking at the directory." "We understand, but we do need you to come with us now." The atrium was full. A Saturday afternoon in April, school holiday week, and the Meridian Grand was at the kind of capacity that the operating reports, the ones she had been reading for 6 years in an office nobody knew she had, described as peak Saturday traffic. Families, couples, teenagers moving in formations of 4 and 5, a class of children in matching yellow vests near the fountain, and all of them, in the particular peripheral awareness that crowds develop for disruption, had begun to orient toward her without quite looking. She held the notebook at her side. She looked at Brennan. She looked at Kowalski. She looked at the mezzanine above the East Wing, where a cluster of 3 people in dark blazers stood at the railing watching, and she recognized the center figure, Gerald Price, general manager of Meridian Grand Shopping Center, a man who had been in that role for 4 years, 2 months, and approximately 17 days, by the way he stood. Hands on the railing, weight forward, the posture of a man observing something he arranged.
"All right." And she went with them. The hand on her elbow steered her toward the East Service corridor, away from the main floor, so that the exit would be invisible from most of the atrium. They walked at a pace that was not quite a march. They passed a Costa Coffee, a children's shoe shop, a pop-up seasonal display for the upcoming bank holiday weekend. Nobody stopped them. 3 or 4 people looked up from their phones. One woman with a stroller tracked them with her eyes until they turned the corner.
At the service exit, Kowalski held the door. Brennan stood back. The door opened onto a gray concrete loading bay, and beyond it, across the service road, a row of wheelie bins and a staff car park. "We appreciate your cooperation," Brennan said. She stepped through the door. It closed behind her. She stood in the loading bay for a moment. The April air was cool. A delivery truck idled 40 feet away. A seagull sat on the roof of the building across the service road and watched her with no particular opinion. She opened her notebook. She uncapped her pen. She wrote one line. Then she walked to her car. "Please let me know in the comments where you are watching today before we continue. I'm always fascinated by how far these tales can reach. Don't forget to subscribe to Finest Tales if you like strong, poignant tales of treachery, secrets, and unforgettable retribution, because this story only gets more bizarre from here on out." The car was a 2014 Volvo Estate, silver, with a dent in the rear quarter panel that she had been meaning to get fixed for 2 years. She sat in the driver's seat, notebook open on the passenger seat, and did not immediately start the engine. She had been coming to Meridian Grand for 6 years, not always in person. Sometimes the visits were proxied, done through her facilities coordinator or her asset manager, but enough that she knew the building the way you know a house you grew up in. She knew that the ventilation unit above the West Food Court ran slightly warm in summer and had been patched rather than replaced in 2021. She knew that the East Wing anchor tenancy, the one that had been a department store for 14 years, had been vacant for 22 months before the current operating company had finally filled it. She knew the age of the roof membrane, the status of the fire suppression upgrade, the arrears history of 3 of the smaller tenants on the upper level. She knew all of this because Meridian Grand Shopping Center, all 340,000 square feet of it, its car parks, its service roads, its loading bays and plant rooms and tenant improvement allowances and ground lease obligations, belonged to her. Not to Celeste Armand, the woman in the linen blazer. Not to any name Gerald Price had ever seen on a document that crossed his desk. It belonged to Armand Property Holdings, Channel Islands Limited, which was the sole beneficial asset of the Renard Family Trust, of which Celeste Armand was the sole beneficiary, a fact that was recorded in the trust deed, in the registered office of a law firm in St. Helier, Jersey, and in the memory of her father's solicitor, a man named Clive Osei, who was 71 years old and had been managing the Renard family's legal affairs for 34 years. The mall had come to her the way most things in her family came, quietly, without announcement, and attached to a condition. Her father, Edward Renard, had built his property portfolio across 4 decades and 3 continents, and had structured it with the particular paranoia of a man who had watched other people's wealth get stripped by divorce courts, tax authorities, and opportunistic relatives. Every asset sat behind a structure. Every structure sat behind another structure. The beneficial ownership traced back to the trust, and the trust's existence was not a secret, but its assets were. Her father had told her once that the best protection for a valuable thing was the assumption that it didn't exist. He had died when she was 31. She was 37 now. For 6 years, she had been learning, methodically and largely alone, what she actually owned. She had not grown up rich. That was the thing people who eventually found out about the trust always struggled to reconcile. Edouard Renard had kept his personal life rigorously separate from his assets. He had lived in a mid-terraced house in Wolverhampton with his wife and daughter, driven a Rover that was always slightly too old, worn suits that he bought on sale and had tailored. He had eaten packed lunches. He had argued, with genuine feeling, about the price of heating oil. He had sent Celeste to the local comprehensive and then to a former polytechnic because he believed, with the same conviction he brought to everything, that education at a genuinely useful institution was worth more than a credential from somewhere expensive. What he had not told her until the letter arrived from Clive Osei 6 weeks after the funeral was that the packed lunches and the Rover and the careful heating bills had been a choice, not a necessity. That the house in Wolverhampton sat in a street where 3 of the neighboring properties were also owned by the trust. That the trust's portfolio included a retail park in Coventry, a distribution center outside Bristol, an industrial estate in Dusseldorf, a shopping center in Leeds, and a mid-sized regional mall in the southeast of England that her father had purchased in 2009 for a sum that she had needed to sit down after reading. Her name was not on any of it. That was also a choice. Her father's. The trust, he had written in the letter that accompanied the documents, was designed to transfer to her at a time when she was ready to manage it, not merely to receive it. Clive Osei had been instructed to wait until she demonstrated, through her own life and her own work, that she understood the difference. She had spent 3 years reading before she started visiting. She was a surveyor by training and had worked for a commercial property firm in Birmingham for 9 years before her father died. She understood leases, valuations, dilapidations. She understood operating covenants and rent reviews and the particular slow violence of a poorly structured service charge. She knew enough to read the portfolio documents her father's solicitor sent her and understand what she was looking at. And she knew enough to know that the smartest thing she could do was to continue, for a while, to look like exactly what everyone had always assumed she was, a mid-career property professional with no particular inheritance and no claim to anyone's attention. So she had continued working. She had taken on more responsibility at her firm, quietly, and had begun, over 2 years, with Clive O'Sea's guidance, to develop a real working familiarity with the assets. Not interfering, not announcing herself, just learning. Reading the management accounts, walking the properties, asking careful questions through intermediaries, and once a month, sometimes more, she came to Meridian Grand and walked it. She had a particular rhythm. The car park first, because that was where most properties showed their operational disrespect. The lighting, the line markings, the signage. Then the service corridors. Then the retail floor, slowly with the notebook. She had been doing it for 6 years without anyone looking twice, until Gerald Price. Price had been appointed general manager 18 months ago, transferred from a retail management group's operation in the East Midlands, and he had arrived with the particular energy of a man who believes that confidence is indistinguishable from competence. He was 44, broad-featured, with the kind of physical size that had probably served him well in rooms where the loudest voice made the decisions. He wore his suits in a way that suggested he had recently started buying them from somewhere better than he used to. His first 6 months at Meridian Grand had been focused on what the management reports called brand repositioning. He had renegotiated 2 anchor tenancies at terms that were, by Celeste's reading, slightly below market. He had approved a refurbishment of the main atrium on a budget that was adequate without being generous, producing results that photographed better than they held up to close inspection. He had introduced a tenant satisfaction survey that produced good scores because the questions were designed to produce good scores. He had also, and this was the thing that had prompted her to begin visiting more frequently, begun to introduce what the internal communications called environment quality protocols. These were, in practice, policies about who the mall's operational team was empowered to remove. The language was careful. It spoke of customer experience optimization and demographic alignment with anchor tenant brand standards. It did not say what it meant in any sentence that could be quoted. But Celeste had been reading property management documents for a long time, and she knew what the language meant. She had flagged it to Clive O'Sea. He had flagged it to the property manager who interfaced with the operating company on behalf of the trust's nominee director. The property manager had sent a letter. The letter had been received. A response had come back, careful, corporate, and entirely non-committal. And the protocols had continued. Today had been her 4th visit in 8 weeks. She had been watching the protocols in practice. She had her notebook, she had her observations, and now she had something she had not had before. She had been walked out herself. She started the Volvo. She put it in reverse. She thought about Gerald Price's hands on the mezzanine railing and the particular tilt of his chin as he watched. She drove home. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table with the notebook and a legal pad and worked for 4 hours. Then she called Clive O'Sea. "I need you to bring everything forward," she said.
A pause. How far forward? As far as it can go. Another pause. She could hear him breathing, the way he breathed when he was thinking carefully about something. The operating agreement renewal is in 6 weeks. I know. If you move before the renewal, Price will have time to... He won't have time for anything, she said. Schedule the tenant summit. The line was quiet for a long moment. Celeste, Clive said. I know, she said again. All right, he said.
I'll make the calls. She had first understood what Meridian Grand actually was, not as a set of numbers on a page, but as a physical thing, a place with weight and history, on her 2nd visit, 2 months after her father died. She had arrived early, before the mall opened, and sat in the car park watching the staff come in. The cleaners first, in the gray-blue uniforms, arriving in 2s and 3s from the bus stop at the top of the service road. Then the security team, in their dark jackets, coffee cups in hand. Then the retail staff, arriving by car and bike and on foot, in the particular mix of ages and appearances that a mid-sized regional mall gathers to itself. She had watched them all go through the staff entrance and had thought, these people's working days happen inside something that belongs to me. It had not felt like power, it had felt like responsibility, and she had not been entirely sure she was ready for it. Her father's letter had said, near the end, I did not want you to inherit wealth before you had the chance to develop the patience that wealth requires. Patience is the one thing money cannot manufacture, and the one thing people who have never had to be patient cannot simulate. By the time you read this, you will have lived your life without the safety net you did not know was there. That is not cruelty. That is the only honest preparation I know how to give. She had read that paragraph many times in the 6 years since. She had understood it differently each time. Now, sitting at her kitchen table at 11 at night, with Clive Osei's assurances about the timeline written on her legal pad, she understood it completely. The weeks between the loading bay and the summit were the quietest of her professional life. She went to work, she met with clients, she filed her reports. She spoke to Clive twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and once to the QC he had retained, a compact woman named Daisy Wren, who specialized in property law and who had a manner of absolute stillness that Celeste found reassuring. She did not go back to Meridian Grand. She did not need to. What she did instead was read. She read the operating agreement between the trust's nominee company and the management firm Pinnacle Retail Operations Limited that Gerald Price worked for. She read it in the way you read something you have read before but are now reading with a different question. She read the tenant leases, all 47 of them, and identified the ones where the operating company had been negotiating without adequate authority. She read the service charge accounts for the previous 3 years and identified a pattern that Daisy Wren, when Celeste sent her the figures, described on the phone with one short word that was not a legal term. She read the press kit. It had been emailed to the local business journal 3 weeks after the loading bay, under the subject line, Meridian Grand, a new chapter. Gerald Price had been photographed in the main atrium, standing in front of the fountain, jacket open, one hand in his pocket, looking at something to the upper left of the frame, in the way that the subjects of aspirational corporate photography always look at things, as though the future were visible just above the photographer's shoulder. The accompanying text described his tenure at Meridian Grand as a period of exceptional transformation. It credited his strategic leadership with the mall's recovery from the post-pandemic slump. It noted the refurbished atrium, the new anchor tenant, the improving footfall figures. It quoted him at length. It did not mention Edouard Renard. It did not mention the trust. It did not mention the significant capital investment, her father's capital, held in trust for her, that had underwritten the refurbishment and the anchor tenant incentives and the operational liquidity that had kept the property viable through the years before Price arrived. It did not mention her. She read it once. She put it in a folder. She went back to the lease documents. The tenant summit invitation went out under the letterhead of the trust's nominee company, formally, for the first time in the 4 years of Price's tenure, exercising its right under the operating agreement to convene a property review meeting with the tenant body. The invitation was addressed to the principal contact of each of the 47 tenancies, plus their legal representatives where known. It was accompanied by a brief agenda. Price received a copy, as required. His response, via Pinnacle Retail Operations Ltd's legal team, was a letter requesting clarification of the meeting's purpose and a suggestion that any such meeting should be coordinated through the management company's existing tenant communication structures. The nominee company's solicitors, Clive Osei's firm, responded within 24 hours. The response was 3 sentences. The meeting would proceed as scheduled. Attendance was not optional for parties with active lease obligations. Refreshments would be provided. Price called the nominee company's listed phone number. The number went to a professional answering service. He called the listed email. The email was managed by Clive O'Sea's secretary, who responded to each inquiry with the same three-sentence message that the solicitors had sent. He called the management company's own operations director, who called Pinnacle's regional director, who called Pinnacle's head of legal, who sent a strongly worded email to Clive O'Sea's firm. The response was the same three sentences. Celeste knew about all of this because Clive O'Sea sent her a summary each evening. She read each one and made no comment. The machine was running. She did not need to push it. She did, however, call one person herself. Tegan Mbeki was a journalist at the regional business desk of the local newspaper, a woman in her early 30s who covered property, retail, and commercial development with the specific tenacity of someone who had been told several times that her stories weren't important enough to matter and had developed a personal position on this view. They had met 3 years earlier at a property industry event where Celeste had been on a panel and Tegan had been the only journalist in the room asking questions about beneficial ownership structures. Celeste had kept her number. She called her on a Tuesday evening. She said, "I have a story for you. I need you to hold it until I tell you." Tegan said, "How big?" "It's about Meridian Grand." A pause. "The Price press kit thing?" "And everything before it." A longer pause. "Okay," Tegan said. "I'm listening." They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. The summit was scheduled for a Thursday at 10 in the morning in the Meridian Grand Conference Suite, a set of rooms on the mall's second level that the operating company used for management functions, and which Celeste had never been inside because she had never needed to be. She had seen them on the building plans. She knew their dimensions. She knew that the main suite held 62 seated and that the AV system had been upgraded in 2022 as part of the refurbishment budget. She arrived at 8:45. She came through the main entrance, the public entrance, the same set of glass doors she had walked out of, more correctly, been walked out of, 11 weeks earlier. She was wearing the same cream linen blazer, different trousers, the same shoes. She carried a leather document case that had been her father's. She had not carried it before today. She had taken it from the shelf where it had been sitting since she inherited it, and she had packed it the night before with 3 documents, carefully ordered: the trust deed, the nominee company's certificate of ownership, and a single letter on the trust's headed paper. The letter was signed by Adaze Wren, QC, as well as by Clive O'Sea, and by Celeste herself in her capacity as sole beneficiary of the Rennard Family Trust, which she had never before had occasion to sign anything in. There were no security officers in the atrium at 8:45. There was a cleaner with a floor polisher and a young woman opening the shutters on a coffee stand, and a maintenance technician checking something on a panel near the fire exit. None of them looked at her. She took the elevator to the second level. She walked to the conference suite. The door was open. A woman from the catering company was arranging cups at the far end of a long table. A man from the AV team was checking a projector. Both looked up when she entered. "Can I help you?" said the catering woman. "No, thank you," Celeste said. She sat down at the head of the table. She placed the document case in front of her. She opened it and took out the 3 documents and laid them on the table in front of her, face down, in order. She put the document case on the floor beside her chair. She folded her hands. She waited. The tenants began arriving at 9:30. They came in groups and singly, some with solicitors or brand managers, some alone. They were the full range of a mid-sized regional mall's tenant roster, the national chains with their area managers and in-house legal teams, the local independents with their accountants and their careful expressions, the food court operators and the service tenants and the phone repair kiosks that were listed on the lease schedule as Unit 47B. They took seats around the table and along the walls. Some of them recognized each other. Some of them spoke quietly. Most of them looked in the way that people look when they have been summoned to a meeting whose purpose they don't fully understand, mildly watchful. None of them, as far as she could tell, had any idea who she was. Gerald Price arrived at 9:52 with 2 people from Pinnacle's legal team and his operations manager, a man named Carl Hester, whom Celeste had identified from the management company's website as the person who had implemented the environment quality protocols. Price was in a good suit. He looked like a man who had decided, sometime in the last 11 weeks, that the best way to manage an unusual situation was to be large in it. He stopped when he saw her at the head of the table. Not for long, a fraction of a second. Then he adjusted his expression and came around to a seat roughly 2/3 of the way along the table's left side, positioning himself in the room as though he were at the head of it. "I think there may be some confusion about the chair arrangement," he said to the room generally, in the tone of a man making an administrative observation. Celeste said nothing. Price looked at her. "The management company typically chairs these tenant communications." She looked at him. "This isn't a tenant communication," she said. "This is a property owners meeting." He smiled, slightly. "And you are?" She placed her hand flat on the first of the 3 face-down documents. She waited another 90 seconds until the last of the attendees had settled, until the room was as full as it was going to be. She could see Tegan Mbeki at the far end, beside a man with a camera bag, both of them with press lanyards. Clive had arranged the press access through the nominee company's right under the operating agreement, and Pinnacle's legal team had not had time to challenge it before the meeting began. She waited until the room was quiet. Then she turned over the first document and slid it to the center of the table. It was the certificate of ownership, the name of the owning entity, the asset address, the registration date, stamped, certified, unambiguous. The room read it in the particular way that rooms read documents they were not expecting. "My name is Celeste Armand," she said. "I am the sole beneficiary of the Renard Family Trust. This trust has held the freehold of this property since 2009. Everything in this building, the structure, the car parks, the common areas, the service infrastructure, belongs to the trust." "Which means it belongs to me." She let that sit. "I have been visiting this property regularly for 6 years. 11 weeks ago, I was removed from the main atrium by 2 members of the security team. I was walked to the service exit and deposited in the loading bay. I was not told why I was being removed. I was not asked to identify myself. I was not given any opportunity to explain why I was here." She looked at Price. He was very still. "I chose not to explain myself at the time," she said. "I want to explain why. Because I have been watching this property for 6 years, and the practice of removing people from its public spaces based on how they look, which is what the management company's environment quality protocols amount to, has been a pattern, not an incident. I am one example. I happen to be the most expensive one." Pinnacle Retail Operations Limited operates this property under an agreement that gives the management company authority over day-to-day operations, but reserves all structural and policy decisions to the property owner. The environment quality protocols, and I have the versions dated October 2022, March 2023, and the current version dated January 2024, were never submitted for owner approval. They should have been. They weren't. That is a material breach of the operating agreement. She looked at Pinnacle's legal team. The operating agreement also contains a conduct clause. It requires that the management company operates the property in a manner consistent with the owner's values and public commitments. I can speak to my values. Carl Hester can speak to what his team has been doing in practice. "There is a third matter," she said. She turned over the third document, the letter, signed by Arazi Wren and Clive Osei and herself. "The operating agreement expires in 6 weeks. Pinnacle's renewal application was submitted in February. The property owner has reviewed it." She laid the letter flat. "It has not been approved." The room was entirely silent. Price's expression had moved through several things. It had passed through controlled and through strategic reassessment, and was somewhere now that she did not quite have a word for, but which was partly the particular quality of a man understanding that the ground he has been standing on has belonged to someone else the entire time. The non-renewal does not affect tenant leases, she said, looking around the table at the operators and their representatives. Your leases are with the property owner, not with the management company. All of your lease obligations and rights remain exactly as they are. The transition to a new management structure will be managed to ensure continuity of operations. You will receive written confirmation of this within 10 business days. She looked at Price. Pinnacle's transition period begins today. The specifics are in the letter.
Mr. Price, your legal team can contact Adazawen's office with any questions. Price opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. You can't simply... The documents are there, she said. There are process requirements. The process requirements are in the operating agreement. Clive Osei's firm has been advising on compliance with all of them for 6 months. Everything is in order. She paused. Is there something else? He looked at the certificate. He looked at the letter. He looked at Celeste.
She was looking back at him with the same steady expression she had worn in the atrium when Brennan's hand had closed gently and politely on her elbow. He said, "Why didn't you just tell us who you were?" She picked up her pen. She wrote one line in the notebook she had carried since the first visit. She capped the pen. She put it in the pocket of the blazer. "Because I wanted to know who you were first," she said. She stood up. She picked up the document case. She buttoned the blazer. "The press are here if anyone has statements they'd like to make. I'd suggest reading the documents first." She walked to the door. She did not look at the mezzanine on her way out, because there was no reason to. She took the elevator down. She walked through the atrium, the fountain running, the floors polished to a shine by the same cleaners she had watched arrive in the car park 6 years ago, and out through the main entrance. The April air was the same temperature as it had been 11 weeks ago. She walked to her car. The dent in the rear quarter panel was still there. She had not yet had it fixed. She had not yet had time. She drove home. She was making tea when Clive called. "Tegan Mabecki's piece is live," he said. "Already?" She was writing it in the room. A pause. "It's thorough." "Good. Price's lawyers have sent 3 emails in the last 40 minutes. Teledize. Done." Another pause. "How are you?" She poured the water. She watched the color move through it. "I'm all right." "Your father would have..." "I know," she said. "He would have been..." "I know, Clive." A silence. "What do you want to do about the property?" She carried her cup to the kitchen table. She sat in the same chair she had always sat in, at the same table, in the same kitchen, in the house that was not the trust's house, was hers alone, bought with her own salary and her own savings, years before she had known there was anything else. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" "I want to appoint a management company that doesn't need to be told what the word inclusion means." She paused. "And I want to put a plaque in the atrium. A plaque. A small one. For my father. He bought the building. Nobody who shops there has any idea." Clive was quiet for a moment. "I think he'd have objected to that quite strongly." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." The aftermath was not dramatic. That was, she thought later, the thing that surprised people who heard the story, who expected it to have been dramatic, who expected Price's removal to have been loud, who expected her to have made a speech. The speech she had given in the conference room was the longest she had spoken in a professional context in years. She had gone home and been quiet for 3 days. Pinnacle Retail Operations Limited negotiated the transition. Their legal team was professional, if unhappy, and the handover was managed with the competence of people who understood that arguing with the freeholders' QC was not a productive use of their remaining time in the building. Carl Hester resigned the week after the summit and was not replaced. His role was absorbed into the new management structure, which did not include an environment quality protocols document. Gerald Price left on the fourth Friday of the transition period. He left through the main entrance at 5:30 in the afternoon with a cardboard box and his jacket over one arm, and the security team, new security team, different faces, a firm that Celeste had found through a contact in the industry, held the door for him. He said nothing.
Nobody watched from the mezzanine. The press kit was removed from the local business journal's website. The journalist who had published it sent Celeste a brief email of the apologetic variety. She did not respond. Tegan Mbecki's piece ran in two parts, the first on the day of the summit, the second a week later. The second piece was about the environment quality protocols and what they had looked like in practice, and it included statements from 4 other people who had been walked out of Meridian Grand in the previous 18 months. Celeste had put Tegan in touch with 2 of them. She did not appear in the piece by name, at her request. Tegan had pushed, and Celeste had been firm, and in the end, the piece referred only to the property's ownership, acting through a private trust. The new management company came in with a different culture, which was not installed through a document, but demonstrated in the particular way that culture is always actually installed, through who they hired, what they paid attention to, what they let pass, and what they did not. The atrium remained the same atrium. The fountain kept running. The floor polisher came through at 8:45 every morning. The plaque went up on a Tuesday afternoon in early June, on the wall beside the East Wing directory, where she had been standing when Brennan put his hand on her elbow. It was small, brushed steel. It read, "This building was acquired and developed by Edouard Renard, 1952 to 2018. He believed that the most important things are the ones nobody knows you have." She stood in front of it for a while. The atrium hummed around her with its ordinary Saturday noise. Nobody paid particular attention to the woman in the cream linen blazer reading the small plaque by the East Wing directory. She had her notebook. She made a note. She walked the floor. 6 months later, she was at the Coventry Retail Park, the third asset in the portfolio, one she had been meaning to get to for a while, when her phone buzzed with a message from Clive. It was a screenshot of a LinkedIn post. Gerald Price, announcing that he was excited to share that he had joined a new venture in retail consultancy, bringing his extensive experience in shopping center transformation to help other properties reach their potential. She read it once. She put her phone back in her pocket. She opened her notebook. There was a ventilation unit on the west side of the Coventry Retail Park that looked like it had been patched rather than replaced. She wrote it down. She kept walking. The question that stays with this story is not why she waited. It is not about patience or strategy or the particular discipline of a person who has learned to be still in rooms where noise is mistaken for authority. The question is this: how many times, in how many lobbies and atriums and conference rooms and service corridors, have we assessed someone's right to be present, their right to take up space, to belong, to have weight in a room, not by what they know or what they've built or what they carry in a document case or in a mind that has been reading for 6 years, but simply by what they look like standing at a directory with a notebook? And if the answer to that question is more times than we can count, then what are we actually protecting when we put our hand on someone's elbow and smile?